Hi, I'm Rob Crowley, and welcome to your last breakout session of DDD 2021. And in this session, we'll be looking at what it takes to think like a CTO. So many of the talks at this year's conference focused on the myriad new technologies, frameworks, and products that are available for us to use. This talk's going to be a little bit different. And over the course of the next hour together, we'll be looking at how to derive value from technology and how to make decisions that will yield valuable business outcomes. And our agenda is pretty ambitious. We'll start on a primer on strategy itself, review the key considerations involved, and cover several models that can assist with generating strategic insights. From there, we'll look at how you can bring this back to your own jobs and start building a reputation as someone who can think both laterally and deeply about a problem from multiple perspectives. We'll also look at technology strategy from three perspectives. Firstly, we'll explore what it is, its purpose, and how it relates to business strategy. With this base level of understanding, we'll then explore an approach for defining, communicating, and evolving a technology strategy. And finally, we'll look at one of the most important aspects of a technology strategy, and that's the decisions and the actions that underpin it. So before proceeding, I'll share a little bit about myself. I am the head of engineering for a company called Fix Technology, and at Fix we build transport solutions for cities. So in the context of the UK, Manchester will be one of the cities that we support. And previous to that, I was a principal consultant for Telstra Purple, where I worked with CIOs and CTOs on defining their technology strategies. And I'm also a co-organizer of DDD Perth in Australia. And I'm absolutely in awe of my fellow committee members and all of the volunteers and sponsors who have helped make DDD 2021 a possibility. I'm also available on the socials at Rob D. Crowley. So if you have any questions or comments following the session, please get in touch either on Discord or you can send me a direct message on Twitter. But with that, I also have a confession to make. I absolutely love shiny technology. But my hope is that by the end of this talk, I will have helped you to look at technology with just a slightly different perspective and given you some techniques to help you assess its suitability for the user or business outcome that you're looking to achieve. So with that, let's take our first view at strategy. And I've used that word a number of times already in this talk. So what is it? So when in doubt, consult a dictionary. And our friends at Macquarie Dictionary tell us that strategy is a plan of action designed to achieve a long-term or overall aim. And from this definition, we can see two things. Firstly, we can see it's about making decisions and acting upon them. And secondly, that this activity is performed to achieve a long-term vision or aim. But now I've just done it again, haven't I? I've introduced another new word, that's vision. And this is a word or term that often gets used in the same conversations as strategy. But how do they relate? So let's look at the three core pillars that often get confused around this: purpose, vision, and mission. And purpose is why you do what you do. It's really why your organization exists. And at Fix, our purpose is to connect people and places, and it acts as our true north. Vision is about what you will achieve in the future, the results you wish to strive for, the measurable impact you will have on the world. And the mission, well, that's what you will do or build to achieve your vision. And mission should be actionable or concrete. And at Fix, our mission is to make mobility seamless. And it's one of the core principles that we apply to any of the products or services that we provide. And to illustrate this, so Microsoft's corporate vision is to help people and businesses around the world realize their full potential. So again, quite broad as befitting the many different services and areas in their business. But the mission then is to empower every person and organization on the planet to achieve more. So with that, we can see the purpose is the why, the vision is the what, and the mission is the how. And a strategy uses the mission to achieve the vision. But don't get confused. These three words are often, while they play a part in a strategy, they are far from the strategy itself. So let's now look at some of the facets or considerations that you have to think when defining a strategy for a company. And the first insight that we need to understand is that effective strategy cannot be created in a vacuum. Or as John Boyd says, if you do not learn from the outside world, you are doomed to failure. Without context, it is impossible to differentiate between what would be a beneficial or harmful decision, and by extension, the actions that you would take to realize them. So we need feedback loops. And feedback loops, which we'll explore more later, are a fundamental part of defining an effective strategy. Companies with an effective strategy are ones that can adapt and learn over time, not simply have an effective idea or action at a single point in time. And the ability to learn from the environment is called situational awareness. And the environment in this context is the industry in which you operate. And changes can occur to this environment which you can't control. It's just like the weather. New innovations are created, competitors can launch new products, global pandemics can undermine our best laid plans. Rather than being face-to-face in a conference venue today, again, we're having an online conference. So we have to be able to adapt to changes around us. And a key point as well is that these changes can be harmful or beneficial. And the operating context is at a constant state of flux. So for example, the company's strategy can be perfectly effective one day and then ripped asunder the next. So WeWork is a prime example of a business context which has dramatically changed with the rise of COVID. So WeWork have shared occupancy spaces for workers. And when COVID hit, their building occupancy fell to the floor, except that their commitments to their landlords remained the same. Again, their revenue dips, but their costs remain the same. Not a good situation to be in a company. But conversely, the pandemic has been a huge financial boon to video conferencing companies like Zoom. And it's not just the technology space alone. In transport, which the industry in which I work, COVID has had a massive shift in how people pay for travel. So particularly in the US, it has taken paper cash out and got replaced with smart card payments or debit card payments. So again, the rise of contactless has been huge as a result of COVID. And another insight is that competition drives evolution in an industry. Or to reposition this, without competition, stagnation will arise. But not all companies adapt to changes in the environment at the same time. So as William Gibson said, the future's already here. It's just not evenly distributed. For instance, some companies embraced cloud computing really early on and shifted from treating their servers from pets to cattle. And more recently, with the advent of serverless and pay-as-you-go, it's evolving from a product to a commodity or utility, just like electricity. And how companies respond to changes in the environment can vary dramatically, not just on the situational awareness, what's happening outside, but also their own internal market position and by extension, their ability to leverage it. For an example, let's turn our attention back to the 1990s, where we'll have a view where the disruptors, which we often feel are the ones who hold the future, we will see that it's not always first that will win. And that it's actually, again, the combination of multiple factors that will have the ultimate say. So back in the early 1990s, let's look at the first browser war. And Netscape began with about an 80% market share and a good deal of goodwill around their product. They had a single product, however. Microsoft was looking at this with a new emerging browser market, and they had a massive 90% share in the desktop operating system. So they started to bundle Internet Explorer with every version of Windows. And they then used their supply chain, to overcome what was really not a savvy customer base at that stage. Customers couldn't really see what was the valuable features that Netscape had versus Internet Explorer. And over time, Microsoft dominated that, not because they had a better product, but again, because they were able to leverage their Internet Explorer base through Windows. So by adopting a fast follower strategy, they could easily crush the competition who were overexposed in a single product. But it should be noted as well that once Internet Explorer had won that first browser war, a period of stagnation resulted, which ultimately led to the rise of Chrome, which exists to this day. So, as well, we often think Apple is one of the most innovative companies in the world. What they do is inherently a fast follower model as well. They look at what's happening and then they think about the user experience and the overall, and then through complete vertical integration of their supply chain, they can then outcreate and ultimately create more buy-in or goodwill from their user base through it. And expectations of users change over time as well. So let's take a quick look at the Kano model. So this is typically used to prioritize features on a product roadmap and based on the degree to which that feature is likely to satisfy customers. I'll use it for a slightly different purpose here though, and we'll show that how customers' expectations change over time. So the features in the top right-hand corners are the ones that will lead to high degrees of customer satisfaction. Again, in the case of mobile, a handful of years ago, that would be facial recognition. And that would have been one of the huge changes in whether you buy one device or another. Today it's standard, and if you don't have it, it's likely that your product will not find any favor at all. So over time, attractive features becomes must-haves. And it's the same with technology. The novel becomes commonplace, but in turn allows the creation of more complex innovations. So for instance, with compute that we talked about before, once we started looking at IaaS and cheap virtualization of compute, going from effectively a product to the utility it is with serverless now, that allowed a new wave of innovation around big data machine learning that wouldn't previously have been possible. And it's also very likely that in your business, you are going to have different areas that are at different stages of maturity. So some areas that might be incredibly new or novel that you're looking to experiment, but then you're also having other very mature products. How do you balance those two? And the trick is you can't have a single approach for everything. One, you're looking to learn really quickly. The other one, you're actually looking to maximize the revenue that you would have from it. So with this insight that we can't apply one approach across everything, then how might we flex our approach or our company structure to enable the appropriate method or approach for each life cycle or stage that the product or capability is in? And Kent Beck, so the man behind XP, so when he was at Facebook, he defined a model called 3X around explore, expand, and extract. And if we look at this graph, we have payoff on the y-axis and success on the x-axis. So payoff is from the producer perspective. Effectively, does it work for the business? And success is from a customer perspective. Does it work for the customer? And we're looking for win-win scenarios. And we want to choose a strategic approach that's appropriate to the level. So at the start, when we're exploring, that is when we're trying to find product market fit, and we want to eliminate uncertainty. So we're looking to learn. Then once we have a number of customers on the platform or product, we then wish to, again, expand that. So we want to start getting more payoff from it. But at this stage, the cost of any inefficiencies in the product are going to be magnified. So we then look to eliminate forms of muda or waste. And then finally, at the end, when you were looking to maximize the value from it, we're actually looking to eliminate variability. It could be a very mature market. We're no longer wishing to disrupt. The needs are very clear. And in this case, we're looking to eliminate variability. And across each of these stages, when it comes to eliminating uncertainty, Agile is absolutely wonderful. breaking things down into small batches, inspect and adapt loops. When we're looking at waste, we have a lot to learn from lean. And again, waste elimination. And Six Sigma comes into play when we're looking to eliminate variability. So it's not about a single approach across all of the stages of your product, but understanding how you can flex the approaches based on what you're looking to achieve around the product at that point in time. And also, this is important because our risk appetite decreases over time. In the beginning, we're looking to experiment as quickly as possible, and our risk appetite is quite high because we've invested very little. But as we've invested more over time, our risk tolerance decreases. And this can often lead to a scenario where companies don't want to take risks anymore. And actually, many companies, we saw with Nokia, who did have a wonderful history of innovation, ultimately were too, I guess, stuck with their own models. We've seen Blockbuster as well that were obsessed with late fees and ultimately turned down an opportunity to buy Netflix. And well, we know what history wrote around that. And in the book called How to Lead a Quest by Dr. Jason Fox, he introduces a really nice metaphor for this challenge that's facing companies. And it's called the Kraken of Doom. And that is the monster that awaits companies who can't adapt to changes in the environment. And in this book, he defines a model for approaching different types of work from the certain, that is the established products that you have, through to the more pioneering work, so the experiment where cause and effect is not clear. And for that clear work, he calls them missions, where they're operational. So we have a clear, certain outcome, and it's about action. But then on the top right-hand side, we then have pioneering work. So quests. So that is where we're looking to break new ground, where we're looking to learn. And when we're looking at missions, we have a clear strategy, which we could then make decisions, take actions, and go to progress. That is typically the areas of the business that are very well understood. But we don't have that luxury with quests. We have to take a different approach. Ultimately, we are looking to create a set of options, and then options allow us to ultimately make decisions and then act upon them. But within options, we're looking to start with hypotheses. And with that hypothesis, we then create an experiment, which then lets us test the validity of that using the scientific method. And then based on the output of that, we generate insights. And we'll dig into this in a little bit more detail in the OODA loop in a couple of slides, which is a concrete process for how you go through that view of options, then making a set of decisions and ultimately repeating that as well. So one of the key points around an effective strategy is it's not just about a fluffy mission, purpose, or vision. The core of a strategy is actually the decisions and the actions upon them. And they all have to be coherent towards a particular goal. So John Boyd, again, we saw a quote from him earlier in this talk, again, as one of the great thinkers in this, originally a US fighter pilot. And when he was teaching or instructing his fighter pilots around dogfighting, he defined this OODA loop. And his hypothesis was the quicker that a pilot could observe where they are, the situation in which they're in, where the other plane is, all the other external, again, that situational awareness of reading from the environment. And then after that, where they could orientate, so they could position themselves within that environment. And from there, create a set of options and then decide which option is going to yield the best outcome, and then acting upon it. So observing is about sensing the outside world, the circumstances, the information. It's that situational awareness. Then orientating is then the analysis of this, so understanding that information. So in the case of Microsoft in the first browser war, it's understanding that actually the strong market position they have in the desktop space allowed them to be more cautious in terms of that because they knew they had an opportunity to outpace Netscape. Then deciding, so that's the hypotheses, option selections, and providing feedback. And ultimately, the key thing is then acting upon those decisions. And this is a loop. So strategy is not a linear process, but it's an iterative cycle. And again, as John Boyd instructed his fighter pilots, the quicker you can do that loop, the quicker you'll be able to adapt and adapt to changes in the environment. But one of the things about strategy that it's very hard to differentiate between a effective strategy and one that just looks good on paper. And unfortunately, through a lot of my career, I've seen companies that have a beautiful purpose, vision, and values up on a wall. Everyone looks at the posters, but they fail to address the key challenges that the company needs to overcome. It's more like a list of dreams or goals, but a good strategy needs to define a set of coherent actions, and they're not, as I mentioned before, implementation details. They're really the core of the strategy itself. And the actions need to reinforce themselves. They need to be coherent, but they also need to be rooted in the challenges that the company are facing, and then the actions to overcome that and ultimately achieve the goal. If they're not rooted in context, it will not be an effective strategy. And this is what really requires that hard work and understanding of not only the external context, but also the own limitations and challenges your company will need to overcome. And there's no substitute for this. This is again why it's incredibly difficult to bring in one of the big four consultancies to solve these problems for you, because it's not about the success of other companies. It's really understanding your own context and then where that plays in the environment around. But strategy, it's really an informed opinion about how to win. And to be successful, you need to have an iterative approach with high context feedback loops. And competition is always driving change. And you can't control this, you have to embrace it. And by embracing it, you build your situational awareness. And there's certain models, as we've seen. So we've seen the 3X model by Kent Beck, we've seen the OODA loop by John Boyd. And these are tools that I practice every day to help promote deliberate thought around this. And strategic thinking is a skill, and just like any skill, is subject to the Dreyfus model of skills acquisition. So it requires, we all start as novices, and then over time, through dedication, we may become masters or experts at it, but there is no shortcuts for that. So with a really whistle-stop tour of strategy, now let's look at technology strategy. So the bits that's really the core of a CTO's role. And technology strategy is a collective set of decisions created to guide the use of technology or related factors to achieve a business or end user outcome. And one of the key pieces from there is achieve business or end user outcomes. Because an effective technology strategy should amplify a business strategy. It can't exist in a vacuum. It needs to amplify the business strategy to be effective. And the chosen metrics should reflect the business outcomes. And through my years of consulting, I found one of the best ways of defining a technology strategy and making it accessible is to go a long form document, both in terms of the definition of it, but also having it as a living artifact that teams can use, reference, and ultimately use to guide their decisions. And the sections of a technology strategy are roughly listed here. So as I mentioned before, they really start with the business strategy. And this is the part that's actually devoid of technology. So it might sound like a strange advice, but when you start defining a technology strategy document, you don't start with the technology. You start with the business context around it. And this clear articulation helps provide that alignment to the problems and the challenges that the business is facing and the outcomes they're looking to achieve. With that established, you then define the tech landscape. So that would be to create a shared vision of the current limitations. Remember when I said effective strategy has to look at the challenges that you're facing today. So you're not going to go to a bank and suddenly say, put everything into Lambdas in the cloud, because they're going to say, well, what about our core banking system? So again, it has to be rooted in reality. And if there is then going to be a certain migration strategy, then you're really looking at strangler patterns, moving some of that functionality out into services. So again, That might be one approach to it, but it has to be understanding where you are today. The next part is defining the tech vision or North Star. This is really where you want to go. So where you want to enable experimentation, innovation. It might be about leveraging existing platforms or retiring other platforms. It might be about cost reduction or increase innovation. And then there's also the bit about technology guardrails or principles. So as Steve Jobs says, why hire great people and then tell them what to do? What we really want to do as leaders is create an environment which encourages effective distributed decision making. And we can do that in the context of a technology strategy by providing principles and guardrails so that when teams are making decisions, they can then use these for guidance. So let's take an example from a company in Australia who create personal financial management software, MYOB. And this is the platform manifesto that was written by their previous CTO, Simon Reich-Allen. And it's written in a very similar way to the Agile Manifesto. And this is again is the guidance that he provided his teams when making their own decisions. And it contains things like medium-term decisions over short-term thinkings, capabilities as services rather than monolith extensions. It looks at stable technologies over the unproven. So you can quickly draw some inferences from here. This company has already found product market fit. They're looking to eliminate waste. They're really in that center section of that expand in the 3X model. So they're really looking to promote decisions and actions that are focused on the medium-term view. So actually the guardrails and principles would have changed over time as well. Finally, there's about surfacing the information or the technology that is currently used in the landscape. And I've used the Build Your Own Radar by ThoughtWorks quite successfully with a number of companies here. I have heard mixed feedback from other people about their adoption in terms of the level of granularity of how they've used them themselves. So as always, your mileage may vary, but I'll include links in the resources slide at the end so you can explore this approach yourself. And then there's also defining the knowledge management around the decisions you make. And this is through lightweight architecture decision records. So I've called them decision spaces with a number of clients that I have in terms of keeping a history of all the sizable or major decisions that a company has made to again build empathy in the future around how the company got here. So a key thing is, again, strategy is iterative. So just like that, when we're defining a technology strategy, don't aim for perfection on the first pass. Time box it. When I generally write them, I try to get the first draft out in a month. And that's again after all the stakeholder feedback, and then repeat. And treat the document as a living artifact. So again, have regular review cycles. So typically every 3 months, you would come together and say, is this still reflective? Do we have to update some of the guardrails or practices that we have? Are some of the products now reaching maturity? Do we want to guide decisions away from exploring down to more of cost reduction or eliminating waste? So again, understanding that it maps back to the context in which your products are and the operating context. So technology strategy, it really needs to amplify the business or user outcomes to be effective. And defining a long-form technology strategy document is really a great way of building alignment around it and making it real. And just like strategy, take an iterative approach for it. And it only is going to add value if it's visible and accessible. So I strongly encourage new starters to have the technology strategy as part of their onboarding process so that they read it, make it real. So it's not just a document that lives on a file share somewhere or some storage in the cloud. Again, make it real and have your teams talk about the principles when they're making decisions locally. And so probably my favorite part of this talk is the metrics. And this is really how you measure what matters. So when I said make the business outcomes your goal, this is really how you decide, how you define what to measure. And situational awareness is absolutely critical, but user needs, well, they can't be met by just becoming aware of them. So the single most important question you can ask is this work aligned with our user needs? But before progressing, let's again define a definition for a metric. And you won't find this in the dictionary. This is my own definition and the ones that I align my teams around. And a quantifiable measure of any component or process used to gauge the performance of the business, again, business, so outside in rather than inside out, and whose change should inform whether the existing behavior should be continued or adjusted. So a metric is only valuable if it drives behavior, and a metric can apply to an application, a business, a process, or a system. And let's look at how you might use a set of metrics to then help you assess from a set of options, which is the best option that we will then decide to take. So with an evolutionary system, at any point in time, we will have several options available to us. And what we're really looking at is which one of those experiments or options will then yield a beneficial outcome. And that's again where we can look at changes in metrics to then say, has this change in behavior yielded the outcome which we wish to see? If it has, then great, continue down that path. And again, at that stage, we again have several other options. And then based on those hypotheses, we can then use those changes in the metrics to determine whether our behavior is being effective. And then we can continue on to some arbitrary end. And of course, in an evolutionary system, we have no end, but it's the same process that continues around. So how should good metrics be chosen? I've hinted at this before, haven't I? It should always be rooted in your users' needs. And a key piece of advice here is don't start with a metric. Don't start with a metric and then try to figure out how it applies to users. So a good process that's been suggested by Eric Ries in his book, The Lean Startup, is to figure out what's important to your organization. What are your goals? Then think of a couple of ways in which you could move the needle on one or more of these goals and start an initiative. Assemble a team that will actually execute said initiative. Then and only then think about a good metric that the team can use about making progress. And good metrics focus on numbers that matter. So again, that actually reflect the true business value of it, or the true business value you're trying to achieve rather than some proxy for it. It's a number that you can actually drive behavior around. So again, the biggest question that you can ask is this work aligned to our user needs? And the metrics should show that. So a bit more concretely, Dave McClure defined a funnel that maps customer lifetimes around your products, typically called the pirate metric funnel. And around this, he says that at any stage, your customers will fall into one of these buckets. So at acquisition, you're really looking at how do users find you? At activation is how does user find you to actually, how do you ensure they have a great first experience? Then at retention, it's, well, after that first experience, do they continue to come back? Do you build loyalty? Once you have loyalty with one customer, then how do they become advocates and tell others? And then finally, how do you make money from them? And what I should say is that these steps are not necessarily sequential, but in this particular model, I have put activation and retention. So I'm actually looking at growing my user base before I'm actually looking to monetize it. And that's typically where you might go with B2C products, whereas B2B will typically have revenue far earlier and then referral will be later down. But using each one of these sections can help define what matters to my users at each one of these stages. Simon Wardley has a huge amount of valuable information to share with us. So I'd love to be able to cover Wardley maps today, but it's a talk really in its own right. But another thing that Simon Wardley has defined as well is doctrine. And he's defined doctrine as the universal principles that are applicable to any industries or landscape. So for example, spend control. So again, having rigor about what you spend and ensuring that there's back pressure to justify some of that. So if there's universal practices that companies should adopt to be successful, irrespective of landscape or context, are there also metrics that we can use irrespective of the industry in which we operate? And Nicole Forsgren, Jez Humble, and Gene Kim in their work in Accelerate to find that yes, there actually are, and it's the DevOps state of the union metrics that can really help measure the delivery efficacy of a company. And they have proven that having strong delivery performance across those 4 metrics is a predictor for the success of your organization as well. And just to ensure that we're grounded, DevOps is often one of these nebulous terms that even after it's been sort of redefined multiple times, please indulge me. And it's often put forward as a set of practices that help automate and integrate software development and IT teams to deliver outcomes more quickly. I think that fundamentally misses the point. And I get it, that delivering more quickly is again a proxy to what you're actually looking to achieve, which is to learn faster. And the DevOps state of the union metrics are 4. Their deployment frequency, and we want that to be as high as possible. There's lead time for change, so how quickly can you go from an idea to working software in the hands of customers? We want that to be as short as possible. There's mean time to recover, so once we have code working in production, and if we have an incident where there's a loss of availability, how quickly can we first identify it and then fix it and restore service? And again, we want that time to be as short as possible. And then fail change rate, and then that's how many of the changes that you've put out have failed or not had the desired outcomes. And we can group these metrics into 2 main groups: deployment frequency and lead time for change. They're really about speed or productivity, about going faster. And then we have mean time to recover and fail change rate, which are really about stability. And we can use this to drive balanced behavior within our teams. So if we plot this on a graph with speed on the y-axis and quality or stability on the x-axis, and then put forward lead time for change and change frequency on the y-axis and fail change rate and mean time to recover on the x-axis, we can then plot a graph of where do you want your company to be at any point in time. So there's not much point in going incredibly fast with the releases if you break everything, unless you're actually looking to experiment and maybe the value of the learning outstrips the risk of not having a change to go successful. So again, with Mark Zuckerberg, with go faster, break things, when his company was still called Facebook. But again, as the company's products matured and the risk tolerance, again, as Ken Beck defined in the 3X model, decreases, then you absolutely would change some of your focus towards stability. And what the research has shown is that it's absolutely possible to have both speed and quality. They're not mutually exclusive, but you can absolutely focus on one primarily as your company or situation changes. But the road to metrics nirvana is paved in tiers. It is very easy to become the victim of data-driven decisions that are yielding or driving the wrong behaviors in an organization. And let's look at a few examples of this. One of the first ones is don't create metrics that are about avoiding errors. So how many companies do you work at a company that has a metric about number of P1 incidents in the last quarter? Kind of the equivalent of those factory floors, X number of days since the last serious incident. This is actually an awful metric because all it will do is atrophy change. So a release of software into an environment is an injection of entropy. And typically the number of incidents will rise after the number of releases. So what a team might do then is, I will decrease the number of releases I do, but at the same time, we're removing that variability to learn. So again, have metrics that are focused on achieving excellence rather than just avoiding errors. We also have Campbell's law, which is the example of the Cobra effect or perverse incentive. And this is where a metric is defined that is well-intentioned, but ultimately drives the different set of behavior to what we were expecting. So let's look at an example of this. So back in the 1990s in New York and Pennsylvania, they started publishing mortality data on hospitals and surgeons who were doing coronary bypasses. And the idea was that more informed customers would steer themselves towards the doctors with the better statistics. So theoretically, this would be great for the doctors. So the doctors with the better statistics would get more customers, and the customers would also benefit as well from being referred to the successful doctors. But the reality was less ideal. And there's evidence that surgeons started doing more operations on healthier patients while turning away the sicker ones, because while it's horrible, the sickest patients also had the highest chance of dying on the table, and thus impacting their mortality rate data that was surfaced. And the Great Hanoi Massacre is another famous example of Campbell's law in effect. There's also vanity metrics, and these metrics, as I mentioned before, to be effective, a metric has to reflect the business outcome that you're looking to achieve. And if it doesn't, then it might look great on paper, but actually has very little value. So total page views is often a vanity metric for companies because it's not actually driving either revenue or retention from there. So unless you're making money from ad impressions, then total page views could well just be a vanity metric that you can talk about, but isn't actually reflecting your business success. There's also survivorship bias at play, where we use the same metrics as successful companies, but without really understanding whether they align to your own business drivers. So if they're successful, then if we adopt it, we'll be successful too. But this is applying imitation in place of understanding. And it is almost certain that that company, while they might be operating in the same environment as you, does not have the same leverage, product-based market reach. So again, looking back at that first browser war, it means that if you didn't have the same setup as Microsoft in that case, you could be doomed to fail as well. Next, we have usage metrics. This is really the metrics that are focused on outputs rather than outcomes. Again, some classic developer metrics such as total lines of code or total hours worked. Lines of code per developer, even worse. These are useless. Stop recording them. The reason for this is if you look at total lines of code, you actually remove any of the value in terms of thinking it, or your senior developers actually coaching juniors to uplift them. So it can actually look to drive the opposite behavior. So we really should be looking to maximize outcomes with minimal outputs. So don't measure those outputs as a proxy for value. The most worrying use of metrics, though, is when they become weaponized. And this is using metrics for comparison and punishment rather than continuous improvement, really using metrics for evil rather than for good. And that would be a manager using a metric to justify a consequence to apply upon a team within an organization, for instance. And again, there is actually a law for this, and it's Goodhart's law. And he stated that any observed statistical regularity will tend to collapse once pressure is placed upon it for control purposes. Again, managers abusing that information. Or to make that more generic, when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. And how do we avoid this? So confronting this organizational anti-pattern can be a great first step, calling it out, avoiding it by removing information silos, making sure that information asymmetry is removed. And again, creating metrics in pairs. So just like the DevOps data, the union metrics can be used in positive tension against each other. Again, defining your metrics in that way can help avoid this weaponization. So some metric takeaway. Pivot conversations to be based on metrics rather than non-actionable opinions. This is absolutely key. So actions and decisions are what underpin a successful strategy. And again, metrics are used to drive whether that behavior is yielding the outcomes we wish to or not. And use customer needs as the basis for your initial set of metrics. And key thing, incentive structures work. So metrics define that incentive structure. So measuring the wrong thing can lead to disastrous consequences. and metrics only deliver value if they influence behavior. Okay, so in the last few minutes together, we're going to look at what are some of the techniques or tips that you can bring back to your own organizations to start becoming more renowned or building your own strategic acumen. And I should state that the transition between a delivery focus and a strategic one is non-trivial. It does require dedication and commitment. So in the references section at the end of this slide deck, which I'll share, I've included all of the blog posts and books that I have found useful throughout my career, but also the creation of this talk. But I don't have any snake oil or quick wins. So strategy is a skill. And while it's a hard-won skill, it can be incredibly valuable. I do feel that at a certain point in your career, it will not be your technology capability that will be the determinator on future progress, but it will be the breadth of other skills that you can bring to bear. And the first thing is truly invest in learning your business or industry. So I have been a career contractor. In many cases, I was looking to build my core transferable skills and as little about the domain or industry as possible. And that was really the first, because when I didn't invest in the business, I then lacked the context to make effective decisions. I lacked the context. And the key thing from there is the context is key. So when you have it, and again, that would be either about the environment itself or around a specific area within the business, share it with team members and embrace empiricism. So base conversations based on these metrics rather than non-actionable outcomes. And data can be a wonderful way of improving your influencing skills within an organization. And you may not always have the authority to make a decision, but you can always champion a cause. So again, look at it then engaging with one of your, if there's a fellow teammate who has, broader connections, or if you have a manager who can help deliver it from there, you can always champion that cause and then have a leader take that forward. And building your network, both inside and outside of work, can be incredibly valuable. So hallway tracks at conferences like this can afford great opportunities for learning things, not just about technologies, but just what's happening in other businesses, what's happening in other industries, because you can always be surprised how applicable that is back in your own. It mightn't be immediately apparent, but all of that context can really help. And if you are a leader, so if you have a team that you manage, you really should be focused on building an environment which encourages the behavior you wish to see. So thinking really hard about the metrics that you define for your team. Would you have some around developer or delivery efficacy, maybe like the DevOps State of the Union, but also then about sustainability. So what about colleague engagement, unwanted attrition? From a customer perspective, is it going to be customer NPS, and making sure that we have metrics that really create that balanced view of behavior which you want to see. And as a corollary to that, attempting to embed behaviors that run contrary to the metrics or OKRs or time-based goals defined in your organization, it's doomed to fail. Because if people are going to get a reward, either in terms of a bonus or otherwise, that are defined by a certain set of metrics, and you expect them to behave differently, that's not going to work. So again, looking at the metrics and either changing those ones to create the outcomes. And again, that might be something within your own control, or something again that you can lobby your leader to help deliver. And you can achieve amazing things if you don't need to take credit for everything, but be a catalyst for change, work with your teams, and then help them define the metrics that matter to ultimately your users and by extension your teams. So takeaways, we've seen that strategy is really an informed opinion about how to win. There is not a single way that you can look at a strategy and go, this is the best strategy, because the strategy will always be subjective. It is a view on how to win. And the strategy has to take into account both the environment in which your company operates, but also your own company's strengths and weaknesses. Because what we're looking to do is then apply leverage to an opportunity. And a technology strategy is just like the business strategy. It's an iterative process. So defining a technology strategy in a long form document is a wonderful way of making it accessible. But to be accessible, you have to embed it in how your teams operate. So having it in the onboarding process or regular review is vital to driving the behaviors of your teams around it. We've also seen metrics. That metrics are really that yardstick, that guidance to go whether the actions that you are taking are yielding the outcomes you wish to see. So it's again providing that, has this experiment worked or not? Has it improved the metric which we wish to see? If it does, then continue that course of behavior. If it doesn't, then pivot and do something else. And finally, we've seen a set of tips is really rooted in think beyond technology. Think about your business, think about your users, and really look to get as much broad context around where you're operating as possible, and then looking at ways of growing that knowledge across the rest of your teams or colleagues as well. So as I mentioned before, there are numerous resources which I have referenced throughout this talk. There is also a reading list there as well. Again, I have, if there's going to be a couple of books that I would really recommend, I would start with Good Strategy, Bad Strategy by Richard Rumelt. It's a great primer on what effective strategy would look like. I would then go and read a lot of content by Simon Wardley. So again, he has done a wonderful job of making a lot of his work free to access online. And I've also included the other books such as Accelerator, Turn the Ship Around, which are also excellent reads. In terms of questions, what I will do is I will take questions on Discord after this talk. But thank you so much for your time, and you can find the slides on bit.ly at that URL. So once again, thank you so much for your time, and I hope you have a good remainder of DDD 2021.